you're not horrible. You're even, I would say your undergrad is even above where a lot of schools kind of set their cutoff at around a 3, right? The general rule of thumb that we like to go with. But
Slightly
be
moving.
yeah, beyond that, right, you have to remember, and this is where I stress all the time, is that final number is not the number to look at. Ask Dr. Gray Pre-Med Q&A. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
What can I answer for you today?
So, I have a very non-traditional path to med school. I am a professionally trained chef. I started cooking back in high school when I was 14, and I graduated high school early. I went to culinary school, um, came back home after that, cooked for a few more years, and realized I needed to do more with my life. If I was going to work 90 hours a week, I wanted to make a bigger difference.
Yeah.
And so I went back to school, and I've done, I completed a second bachelor's degree. I've done a postbac. I'm actually a PhD student right now. But applying to med schools, and I was actually applying MD, PhD, my undergraduate GPA is horrible.
Yeah.
It's about a 3.08, I think is what it comes out to. And that's because a lot of this, when I was in culinary school, if you didn't want to finish a class, you wanted to retake it next try, you just failed it and took it again next try. And so, and it wasn't a big deal in culinary school, and that's coming back to really haunt me on my applications.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to get schools to look at me because my PhD GPA is a 4.0.
Nice.
And I did well during my postbac, but it only brought my GPA up to like a 3.18 or a 3.2 or something.
Okay.
And so I'm afraid I'm just going to get filtered out whenever I apply.
Mm-hmm.
And no one's even going to see that I've done a PhD and I'm, trying to prove myself academically.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you had any advice for that.
I do. I have lots of advice. So the first comment that you made about your undergrad GPA being horrible at a 3.0 something, right? That's not a horrible GPA. I was talking earlier on an earlier episode of Ask Dr. Gray today with a student who finished with a 2.5. His first year was a 1.7. So you're not horrible. You're even, I would say your undergrad is even above where a lot of schools kind of set their cutoff at around a 3, right? The general rule of thumb that we like to go with. But beyond that, right, you have to remember, and this is where I stress all the time, is that final number is not the number to look at. It's what are all of the trends that go into making that number. And so for you, you have your first undergrad degree, you have a second undergrad degree,
I do.
and a postbac, or the second undergrad degree is your postbac?
Oh, and a postbac.
And a postbac.
When I went back for my prereqs for med school, I already had a bachelor's, so that waived over half of the bachelor's degree at my current school.
Okay.
And so they're like, well, you've pretty much just finished a second bachelor's by doing your prereqs. So
Yeah.
I have a bachelor's in biochemistry.
Okay. So what is the difference between that second bachelor's and the postbac? Was it a formal postbac? Was it just a couple classes here and there? What did that look like?
It was a research postbac with the NIH. So we chose what classes to take. I took maybe 2 classes a semester, but
Okay.
it was heavily focused on research
Okay.
and being in the lab.
Okay. And how were your grades with second bachelor's and postbac?
They're good, but I had to relearn how to be a student.
Yep.
So culinary school is very different from organic chemistry.
I've watched Ratatouille. I know all about cooking.
Everyone can cook ratatouille. But so I was still cooking full time when I went back to school. I started at a community college and then switched to the 4-year college here in New Mexico. And I did well, but then, OChem came along, and that's where I got a C.
Yep.
And OChem 2 came along, and I got a C. And then I had a vendetta against organic chemistry, so I retook both of them. And I ended up with an A and a B
Okay.
in 1 and 2, respectively. And so I would do well, but every so often there were classes that I didn't do well in. Immunology, I got a D. And so I retook it at the graduate level and got a B, but that actually doesn't replace the grade because I retook
Correct.
A undergrad as a grad.
Well, and there is no grade replacement anyway, so it doesn't matter. And immunology isn't a prereq, so it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things anyway, right? So a D for a prereq, you would have to retake because a D isn't passing for medical schools. Um, but you have so talk about the trends of your second bachelor's and your postbac. Are the trends there? Is it up, down, all around? What does that look like?
Semester to semester seems up, down, all around, but it
Okay.
is an increase. So my postbac has a higher GPA than my bachelor's. But then when I look at AMCAS, so when I submit all these grades, and they go and adjust like the status or the year,
Yep.
some of my postbac or some of my prereqs they put in as senior, but then
Yep.
some went in as postbac, some go in as grad.
Yep.
And so the grades are readjusted in very odd ways.
Yeah, so that second bachelor's, most of that will be categorized as senior level classes, just the way that the hours work, right? And then the postbac, the true postbac classes will be listed as postbac typically.
And
What is
most postbac went in as graduate, actually, because you take the
really?
postbac as a non-degree graduate at my school.
Okay, interesting. Okay. The postbac GPA, what is that?
I'm looking at my last AMCAS application, the last time I applied to med school. They created a postbac. Science came out to 3.18 and all other 3.25.
That's your postbac GPA.
It says postbac undergrad GPA. Yes.
Postbac undergraduate GPA. And where are you pulling those numbers from?
The last time I applied to med school, 2017.
Okay. And then so not a huge increase, right? If we look at undergrad, but that's your overall undergrad is 308, or was that your first undergrad was 30 something? Can't really tell based on those.
It says cumulative. Well, it says cumulative undergrad, if I can speak, is 3.08, and then postbac undergrad 3.25.
Okay, so not a huge increase there, but then graduate level and PhD level now, right? Graduate school, you're at a 4.0 for your PhD.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and does that show on those lines? Are you that wasn't part of the
Wasn't part
the
of my last
application then?
application.
Okay. You, as you're going through this process, having applied in 2017, I'm assuming you're only 2 or so years into your PhD program at this point?
Yes, I applied. I finished next year, so I was able to.
Oh, it's short.
accelerate.
Okay.
I was able to accelerate my PhD due to my postbac.
Okay. Interesting.
Is why I was applying MD PhD.
Okay.
It just made more sense to continue and not end my PhD when I didn't get into an MD PhD program.
Okay. And then, so next application cycle, you'll be applying just MD.
Yes.
Okay. So really at this point, you have to just reach out to schools and say, here's who I am, here's where I struggled, but look at me now, right?
Yeah.
And really tell that story of when I started, I didn't want to be a doctor and I didn't have to work hard because it didn't matter.
Yeah.
And the struggle that you will have a little bit is when you did go back to school, when you did do your postbac, when you did know that you wanted to be a doctor, your grades still weren't that much improved, right? And that goes with the story of I had to relearn how to be a student. And actually, I would say you had to learn how to be a student because you didn't learn how to be one for your first undergrad because it just didn't matter. And so you had the normal undergraduate growing pains in your second bachelor's and postbac, and now you've finally hit your stride with your PhD. And you're just going to have to I would say talk to schools before you apply. I would obviously do well on the MCAT to make sure the rest of your application is just as solid with everything else, with extracurriculars, volunteering and shadowing, clinical experience, all of that stuff that proves that you're not just a career student, but you actually want to be a doctor. And let the trends speak for themselves. Will there be some schools that are going to filter you out? Sure. Are there schools that filter students out, but then look through other applications that have been filtered out for the kind of needle in the haystack where you may come through and shine from there? Sure. I think having above a 3.0 will definitely keep you out of a lot of digital shredders so that you will have the opportunity to be reviewed. I think with as low as your GPA is, you will have a harder time getting to the point in the application cycle where they are reviewing your application with enough time and enough seats still available. And so if we can improve that situation by having a much higher, much more competitive MCAT score to maybe cut the line a little bit, that will definitely help. But then remember also those relationships, reaching out to schools now, asking those questions. You mentioned you were in New Mexico. Obviously, New Mexico has a medical school there where they want to train people who live in New Mexico. If you're planning, hopefully, maybe on staying there, you'll have maybe a little bit of a better shot to go to that state school. I would.
Did twice with UNMH actually.
Yeah.
School here.
Great. Yeah. So a lot of networking, a lot of communicating, a lot of storytelling when it comes to the application, and just as much as you can, knocking out of the park your MCAT score to make up for. Even though I'm not really a fan of that term, making up for your GPA with an MCAT score, but potentially jumping ahead in some sort of line when it comes to your application being reviewed because of the weaker GPA.
Okay. Follow-up question. You said to reach out to schools.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mean, should I be reaching out to the admissions department of schools and asking for a phone call, or should I be just in that first email say, this is my story, and see where it goes from there?
I'm all about phone calls. If you can start with a phone call, if they say, no, we don't have time for phone calls, what do you have? Then kind of lay it all out in an email. But if you can get someone on the phone and explain your story, then I think that's more powerful.
Okay. Absolutely. Great.
What else? What other questions do you have?
Oh, I think my only other thing, because I've been in school for so long.
Yep.
And I've been shadowing through this whole time. But honestly, all of my shadowing, for the most part, it's been in orthopedic surgery. Okay. And so I shadow in the clinic, I shadow in the OR. I've mainly been with 2 surgeons this whole time, so I have a good relationship with them. But a lot of schools have that focus on family practice or shadowing a GP. And so I'm actually starting next week shadowing a family medicine doctor here, but it'll only be for probably 3 months before the application cycle.
Yeah.
Does that count? Do you think that would look poorly to have only shadowed someone for a few months?
No, I think it's fine. Remember, on the application, you can project out hours and time. So having all of the shadowing that you have now is great. They're not going to ding you, even if it's a primary care focused school. They're not going to go, oh, she's only shadowed orthopedic surgeons. They won't ding you for that, because schools understand that it's really hard to get shadowing and you get what you get. So the fact that you have now found another physician to shadow somebody who is in primary care, that will definitely help. It doesn't matter that it's only 3 months out because you have all of the other shadowing. Now, it's a completely different question if you're saying, I don't have any shadowing to this point, but I'm going to start shadowing and I'll only have 3 months before my application. That's a different story. But having all the shadowing that you have up to this point, plus what you will continue to get, I think you'll be fine there.
And then shadowing does not count as clinical experiences?
Shadowing is not clinical. And the reason I say that is because on the application, it's a completely different category. Right? So when you are filling out your AMCAS application, shadowing is one category from a drop down, and clinical experience, whether paid or volunteer, is another category. So clinical experience being EMT, right, in the strictest sense, EMT, phlebotomy, a nurse, right, physical therapy assistant, right, those types of things, being a CNA or a medical assistant, any sort of interaction, scribe, obviously being one of them, any sort of interaction with the patients. Now, you may say, well, in my shadowing, I do a lot of interaction with the patients. Well, then it's not technically shadowing, it's probably more clinical experience. Shadowing, in its strictest definition, is you observing, hands off, mouth shut, nothing, right? And so that's where the line is drawn to say, okay, my job with shadowing is to observe the physician, what the physician is doing day in and day out, what her job is like, what she does outside of the patient room. Clinical experience is I need to make sure that I enjoy working with patients, talking with patients, being with patients, and enjoy that interaction. So two completely different activities, two completely different goals of each activity.
And if you gained both of those from the same area or like the same clinic, that's okay.
Yeah, you just split them on the application and just estimate hours for each. So, a good example is a clinical research coordinator. A clinical research coordinator has a lot of different roles, both shadowing, clinical experience, and potentially research. And so, on an application, I wouldn't just put one activity in because then you're not able to appropriately flag and categorize the activity as all three of those. And so, depending on what it is, you can mark one activity as two different things by putting in two activities for that same one activity, right? If that makes sense. So, for you, if your quote unquote shadowing is more of a hodgepodge of stuff, then you would have one activity listed as shadowing, putting the doctor's name, contact information, estimating the hours that were more technically shadowing, and then
Okay.
put another activity in, mark it as clinical experience, same contact information, but then the description and everything else is more focused on the clinical experience side of things and then estimating the hours for that. The one thing I don't want you to do is just, let's say you've done it for a year and you have 500 hours, don't put 500 for each shadowing and clinical experience. Really separate them out, estimate so that it's a total of 500 between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I have one last question
Yeah.
with regards to my PhD. I guess something that's been brought up by my PhD committees a few times is that schools won't look at my application because I'm still in my PhD.
Yep.
And so I don't want it to look like I'm jumping ship.
Yep.
But I am like on track to graduate
Yep.
next spring. Like everything's set and working on my dissertation. So is there a way should I address that in a personal statement? Should I?
No, I don't think that goes in your personal statement. A lot of schools will say that because they don't want you not finishing their degree. And so a lot of it is a scare tactic to say just finish, right? Things happen. Obviously, they've seen students who have been like projected to finish their PhD, and then something happens, and then they don't, and now all of a sudden you're committed to go to medical school, and now you're not going to finish your PhD, and it looks bad on them, right? So a lot of it is more of a scare tactic to say just make sure you're done and then apply. From the medical school perspective, they really don't care, right? Do you want to go to medical school? Do you not? We're going to take you either way. It's not like you're under contract for the PhD to finish that. Students drop out of school all the time.
Okay.
So from the medical school's perspective, will they look and go, wait, what? She's in a PhD. How is she going to finish early enough? A lot of secondary prompts will say if you're out of school, if you've graduated, what are you doing now, like during the application cycle? And you'll have the opportunity to explain yourself there.
Okay. And I guess continuing with like secondaries, should I be explaining this trend in my GPA or like my journey with my GPA essentially?
Yeah, so I would potentially talk about that in your personal statement, in a sentence or two, just a little mini thing about having to come back from a low GPA because you initially wanted to be a chef and blah blah blah, right? But just very briefly talking about that, and then the majority of the story is around why medicine.
Okay. Great. I think you've answered pretty much every area of my application.
Awesome. Well, good luck to you. I think you will be a huge asset for a medical school class to be the class chef. So I'm sure every medical school would love to have you cooking and cadavering with them.
That could be a book title.
Cooking and cadavering. There you go. Well, good luck to you. Thanks for coming on and sharing a little bit of your story.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.